Chapter 1: Understanding Our Environment. Welcome to Environmental Science and the beginning of our lectures. Today, we are going to start with Chapter 1, which provides a general overview of our environment and where we want to go as we move through the course. As you look over the outline, you will notice that the slides are not exhaustive and do not cover all of the material included in your text. However, I do encourage you to read all of the material because you will be held accountable for it. We will be hitting the high points as we move through the slides. As long as humans have walked the earth, they have impacted the environment in which they live. For this chapter, we will be discussing the history of environmental science, our place in the environment, and what we can do to decrease our environmental footprint. In the context of our environment, we need to understand the circumstances and conditions of where we live and the other living things around us. Also included in that, especially and related to humans, are the social and cultural conditions that affect us individually and the living things around us. This is very important for environmental science because it is a very inclusive discipline that includes many other disciplines. So what is environmental science? In a nutshell, it is a systematic way to study the environment and our place in it. As I mentioned earlier, it is a very interdisciplinary subject that includes not only natural science, but also social science, the humanities, and several other subjects. As you can see from this diagram, environmental science is very inclusive and integrates materials from other subjects. Environmental science, as we know it today, is not a static discipline. It has evolved over time as our understanding of the environment and our place in it has changed. As you can see, there are 4 broad stages of the development of our current understanding. It is very important to understand that these 4 stages are not mutually exclusive. With the most current approach, we still find parts of the others in the modern movement. The first stage is pragmatic or utilitarian conservation. This approach was championed by Gifford Pinchot, the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. He felt that resources should be used, but they should be used and managed in such a way that they would always be available for humans to use and to create jobs and products for humans. Through his association with Teddy Roosevelt, he was able to get Roosevelt to start the USFS. The second stage has many names, including aesthetic or biocentric conservation. The hallmark of this stage was the realization that there is value in the beauty of nature, aesthetic, and that nature had a right to exist just for nature's sake, biocentric. John Muir was a contemporary of Gifford Pinchot, but disagreed with him on the conservation of resources. Luckily, Teddy Roosevelt also agreed that some parts of nature had value for their beauty and was instrumental in the establishment of our national park system. Aldo Leopold was a student of Pinchot's and later in life wrote the Sand County Almanac, which is considered a framework for how to view the land. We will talk more about Leopold later in the course. When we think about modern environmentalism, we can't think about it without thinking of Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson actually worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She noticed that migratory birds, especially songbirds, had decreased in numbers across their range. She felt there was a link between this and the use of industrial pesticides, especially DDT. DDT was a widely used pesticide in the U.S. at the time. It was very effective at controlling agricultural pests, as well as insects that were vectors of disease. However, at the time, there was no real regulatory limitations on its use, and she felt its use was detrimental to not only the birds, but also to humans. This was the first real time anyone had linked environmental health with human health and ushered in the use of litigation to force change through legislation. The last stage is global environmentalism. As I mentioned earlier, none of the stages or approaches are mutually exclusive. The global approach shows this because it incorporates all of the other 3. With an increase in information technology, we have recognized that what we do in one place on Earth has impacts on other places, and that resource management and environmental health are linked across all nations. This has led to the concept of think globally, act locally. With that said, it is nice to envision a global approach, but from a practical standpoint, it isn't equitable. For example, most of the world's wealth is found in only 20% of the human population. 80% of all people live in the lower middle to low income categories. This gap in between rich and poor affects many quality of life indicators listed in the following table. The important thing to note is the lack of access to healthcare and education in the poorest countries, while the majority of births occur in those countries as well. This tends to increase the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. This gap continues when discussing access to a healthy environment. We will discuss this later. So how do we address these problems? You will see this term a lot in this course, but one method is through sustainable development. In the context of our discussion, sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the future to our children. If this sounds similar to the pragmatic approach to conservation, sustainable development does, at some level, relate to a pragmatic approach. So why is this important? Sustainable development benefits all peoples, regardless of income, thereby decreasing the division discussed earlier. However, to achieve this, it will take political and economic stability to break the divide. One thing to keep in mind is that sustainability has limits. Because of the nature of our planet, resources are not infinite. This imposes limits on the amount of growth and development that can occur. Many argue that technology will overcome these limitations, but this technological optimism may only delay the inevitable. Thinking back to the image of the relationship between various disciplines within environmental science, one discipline not listed was philosophy. Within this discipline, we find ethics and morals. Ethics are concerned with right and wrong, while morals are our beliefs and standards we use to guide actions in our lives. This idea of ethics is a unifying theme in environmental science. Ethics are often a problem in environmental science because ethics and morals often vary from place to place and people to people. Ethics often drive our center or view of the world. This is important because how we view the environment depends on our values and worldview. This makes it difficult to develop a unified approach to environmentalism. The last things I want to discuss are the concepts of environmental justice, environmental racism, and toxic colonialism. While they may seem independent, at some level these three concepts are connected. Environmental justice combines the civil rights movement with environmentalism, demanding equal access to safe, healthy environments. Environmental racism also addresses inequality in access, but limits the discussion to inequalities by race or ethnicity. Finally, toxic colonialism seeks to address inequalities not by race, but by the wealth of nations. Wealthy nations tend to use poorer countries as dumping grounds for the worst of their waste, instead of accepting responsibility for the waste and its destruction. I hope this chapter provided a good background towards what environmental science is and is not, and that it set the tone for our future discussions.